This lecture is being brought to you in part by the generous gifts of these sponsors.
Thank you very much for that warm introduction, and thank you, Ken and IHMC, for having me here tonight. Hi, everyone. It's good to see you all. The talk tonight is entitled Psychotechnologies of Self-Transformation. How's my volume in the back? Okay. Man is immersed in dreams. He lives in sleep. He is a machine. So said Gurdjieff, a Russian teacher of the 20th century. Until the age of 29, I had been living in a dream. Indeed, I had been immersed in one. It told me, you are here to think about humans in the objective world. You can do this through an institution called a university. Go and devote yourself to this pursuit by finishing a PhD and by getting an academic job. After all those years of living in a dream, I unexpectedly swerved. I finished a PhD and knew something was wrong. In January 2009, I spent countless hours looking out my kitchen window into the backyard. There, hanging from the eaves, was a bird feeder. The bird feeder had, presumably by past tenants of this house, been attached to the eaves via a coat hanger that had been pulled apart and subsequently MacGyvered. It was a precarious affair. Since it was a very cold and very snowy winter, the bird feeder had been wrapped in layer upon layer upon layer of ice. So freighted, it hung, let's say, for dear life, dangling fatefully above the ground. I looked at it. I stared at it. I lost myself in the staring. Why am I doing this? Because in hindsight, it could be said that it was what the poet T.S. Eliot once called an objective correlative. That is, an object that seems to correspond to one's mental state. What I could not yet put into words, how distant I felt from everything. How quietly despairing and utterly lost I really was nonetheless represented in the bird feeder. It said painfully, "Wake up, man. The dream is over." What I experienced then could be called an existential opening. By the latter, I mean whatever it is that breaks one open in such a way that the questioner is turned back on himself or back on herself. That is, an existential opening is, well, what opens me up to my existence. Rattled, shaken, partially awakened, I look at my face, my hands, the world, and wonder, maybe, whether it is all just a dream. All this, yes, but even more, once I'm existentially opened, I bend each question I ask back on myself because, if only dimly or inchoately, I know that I am implicated in what it is that I seek. In the beginning and in the end, the one I seek is myself. Henceforth, therefore, I cannot bracket myself from my own investigations. I learned this also around January 2009 in no uncertain terms upon reading the beautiful and life-changing writings of the French philosopher Pierre Hadot. What Hadot showed was that philosophy is, in essence, not a theoretical discourse, but rather a series of exercises, those he called ascesis, or spiritual exercises, whose point is to utterly transform the practitioner's way of being in the world. In classical Greece and also in the Hellenistic period, philosophical schools arose, each of these, Platonic, Aristotelian, Stoical, Epicurean, and so forth, being rather like an ashram or like a Zen monastery, and all of them being committed to more than mere intellectual pursuits in the art of living. The point of these schools, to put it all too quickly, is to be living wisdom. Here's how Hadot describes spiritual exercises in his book, Philosophy as a Way of Life. Above all, the word spiritual, he says, reveals the true dimension of these exercises. By means of them, the individual raises himself up to the life of the objective spirit. That is to say, he replaces himself within the perspective of the whole. Here, as elsewhere, Hadot describes at considerable length exercises focused on the art of attention, those of a meditative nature, those on learning to dialogue. We might think here of the Socratic dialogue. And, of course, those exercises in dying. For Cicero once observed of Socrates, as he's depicted in Plato's dialogue, the Phaedo, to philosophize is to learn how to die. I was hooked. I resolved from there on out to devote myself to certain of these spiritual exercises, most notably to the art of dialogue, with the goal of becoming wise, or at least of becoming less unwise. This was from 2009 until 2012. And now I have a confession to make. I've since become a Psychotechnologies wild man. Hold on to your seat, people. Each day I meditate in a cross-legged position 3 times for about 3 hours in all. The meditations, varied in nature, are contemplations of the nature of reality. Some of these are Zen in spirit, others tantric in nature, but please don't take the connotations incorrectly here. Others along the lines of self-inquiry. Additionally, my wife Alexandra and I have gone on meditation retreats, which can involve sitting in meditation for 12 or more hours a day, as well as sitting through part of the night. What's more, we've begun exploring other non or more than cognitive exercises, including Zen chanting and recitations of, for example, the 10 cardinal ethical precepts in Buddhism, energetics in the hopes of understanding in an experiential way how energy flows, tantra yoga and focusing with a view to dissolving pain bodies, dream yoga to expand our conscious awareness into the dream and dreamless states, and others besides these. While it would be hard to describe any of these in great detail, let alone to demonstrate them, here's one that may give you a taste of what it is that I'm talking about. It's the 5 remembrances in Buddhism. I am of the nature to grow old. There's no way to escape growing old. I am of the nature to have ill health. There is no way to escape having ill health. I am of the nature to die. There is no way to escape death. All that is dear to me and everyone I love are of the nature to change. There is no way to escape being separated from them. My actions are my only belongings. I cannot escape the consequences of my actions. My actions are the ground upon which I stand. Now just imagine saying that over and over and over and over again. Granted, to the uninitiated, these psychotechnologies and countless others besides may seem odd or pointless or just downright woo-woo. Why on earth, it could be asked, would one do all this, let alone, outside of a monastic setting, devote one's life to these sorts of things? Well, answering this question will take me to the very heart of my talk this evening. I come straight away to my four chief claims. To begin with, we, collectively I mean, are not wise, are not living wisely. That is, we are not embodying living wisdom. Secondly, because we are not wise, we modern human beings as we are not just suffering, where suffering is understood here in a Buddhist key. We are also not up to the task of facing certain existential and cultural predicaments, as I'll explain shortly. Thirdly, the source of our collective dis-ease, or suffering, I'll seek to show is humanism, otherwise known as anthropomorphism. And lastly, what I'm calling psychotechnologies, exercises whose central point is to transform our entire being, will be necessary if we're going to stand a chance of tasting eudaimonia, that is, of experiencing genuine human flourishing and of reconstituting the cosmo-threandric whole. We face a number of predicaments today. Here are five, just five that come to mind. 1, total work, as I've argued in another IHMC talk, has been slowly transforming human beings into workers over the course of modernity. The consequences are needless misery and the near loss of our capacity for deep contemplation, what medievals called the vita contemplativa. 2, nation-states really only became prominent in the 19th century. Liberal democracy, only for Francis Fukuyama anyway, a foregone conclusion in the 20th century. Yet, I ask, are we presently witnessing significant challenges to the legitimacy of liberal democracy and to the organization of geopolitics into nation-states? 3, it doesn't require reading reams of sociological literature to conclude that social atomism, the view according to which each individual is a separate atom that additively makes up the social whole, and a profound sense of loneliness are both on the rise today. People are alone. We might make a chart which would show an inverse relationship between the rise of bullshit talk of community, especially evident among technologists like Mark Zuckerberg, and the decline of actual communities. I don't think a global village is possible, not the least via a certain technological platform. 4, the cognitive scientist John Vervaeke has recently argued that we are in the midst of a meaning crisis. Nietzsche already saw the march of nihilism in the 19th century. And I can confirm the prevalence of nihilism among a number of conversation partners with whom I regularly speak. Being functional, indeed very functional in our society, does not entail experiencing meaning in one's life, let alone knowing what meaning is. And 5, we are living in the midst of what the journalist Elizabeth Kolbert, not related to the comic, calls the sixth extinction. On that score, indulge me for a moment as I read the opening pages of James Gustav Speth's book, The Bridge at the End, or rather the Edge of the World, a book published over a decade ago now. He writes, "Half the world's tropical and temperate forests are now gone. The rate of deforestation in the tropics continues at about an acre a second and has for decades. Half the world's wetlands are gone. An estimated 90% of the large predator fish are gone, and 75% of marine fisheries are now overfished or fished to capacity. Almost half of the corals are gone or are seriously threatened. Species are disappearing at rates about 1,000 times faster than normal. The planet has not seen such a spasm of extinction in 65 years since the dinosaurs disappeared. Desertification claims a Nebraska-sized area of productive capacity each year globally. Persistent toxic chemicals can now be found by the dozens in essentially each and every one of us. The US is losing 6,000 acres of open space each day and 100,000 acres of wetlands every year. About a third of US plant animal species are threatened with extinction. Half of US lakes and a third of its rivers still fail to meet the standards that by law should have been met by 1983. And we have done little to curb our wasteful energy habits or our huge population growth. All we have to do is destroy the planet's climate and biota and leave a ruined world to our children and grandchildren to keep doing exactly what we are doing today with no growth in human population or in the world economy. Just continue to generate greenhouse gases at current rates. Just continue to impoverish ecosystems and release toxic chemicals at current rates, and the world in the latter part of this century won't be fit to live in. But human activities are not holding at current levels. They are accelerating dramatically. Okay, you heard what the man had to say, and yet you're not shocked out of your seats. Why not? Why doesn't this piece of prose inspire action? Better yet, why doesn't it go straight to our hearts, piercing our hearts, while at the same time transforming our entire being? Without trying to answer these questions just yet, let me propose that we allow them to hang in the air for a while. Let this be a mystery for us. First clues to beginning to solve this mystery or this riddle can be found in Ken Wilber's discussion of memes. Wilber, if you don't know, is a pretty unorthodox thinker, someone who has argued that individual and collective history can be regarded as conforming to large developmental patterns. Key to these patterns, he thinks, are certain forms or stages of consciousness he calls memes. I believe of all the memes he describes, 3 in particular shape our current cultural moment. The blue meme refers to organized religions, specifically to believers' adherence to certain doctrines, rules, and an order contained therein. The orange meme is a tent of sorts under which can be found scientific rationalism, materialism in the sense that reality is made of matter or matter and energy alone, sovereign individuality, and secularism. All this, you might say, defines our post-Enlightenment heritage. The green meme, for its part, yokes together postmodernism and cultural relativism with the commitment to social justice. If what you're thinking now is that the ongoing conflicts between these memes make up a good deal of our culture wars today, then I think you'd be on the right track. You can see why religious conservatives could, with good reason, be skeptical of higher education. That is, because of their blue meme commitments. What someone who goes into STEM will learn above the curriculum he or she follows, namely orange meme commitments, and what someone steeped in the humanities will likely come out like. That is, he or she will likely be a green memer. Beyond these observations, however, what strikes me is that all three can be nested within a larger paradigm called humanism, about which more below, and that they contribute to our sense of being stuck, to our inability to face the predicaments I described above, and to our impasse when it comes to the process of becoming wise. Consider the following. Is regular church-going sufficient for helping one to fully and completely love thy neighbor as thyself? Highly unlikely. Can science on its own quell the meaning crisis? I somehow doubt it. Can a commitment to social justice help us overcome total work, the view according to which we are workers? I doubt that as well. And can any of these really and truly provide us with an art of living, one that would, among other things, dissolve entirely our deep-seated, if unacknowledged, fear of death? My conclusion is that they cannot. What we need, I submit, is living wisdom. Yet, what is taught in modern schools bears very little resemblance to this. Instead, what is learned here is a melange of ideas and approaches, ranging from competence or know-how, say knowing how to code, or how to write a research paper, to theoretical knowledge, say about the laws of quantum mechanics, to green meme ideas about diversion, or rather diversity and inclusion. While all of these might, in Wilber's terms, be partially true, none of them, I think, gets us where we need to go today. And so if living wisdom is what we need, then where could we turn in hopes of becoming wise? I suggest that we first turn to history to see how humanism arose, and thus how our dominant worldview took shape. After that, I'll come back to discuss various psychotechnologies. Ramon Panikar, a mystic with 3 PhDs in chemistry, philosophy, and theology, suggests in his book, The Cosmotheandric Experience, that the slogan for anthropomorphism could be Protagoras', namely, man is the measure of all things. In modernity, Panikar goes on to say, man is the center of everything, and measure is at the very core of man. In this respect, we can see that man is, or human beings are, for the first time, historical beings, scientific beings, and above all else, autonomous beings. As such, humankind is above nature and without the divine. Here, let me take a slight detour to pause for a moment in order to consider Alfred North Whitehead's reflections pertaining to what, in and of an epoch, often go unnoticed. He writes, when you are criticizing the philosophy of an epoch, do not chiefly direct your attention to those intellectual positions which its exponents feel it necessary explicitly to defend. There will be some fundamental assumptions which adherence to all the variant systems within the epoch unconsciously presuppose. Such assumptions appear so obvious that people do not know what they are assuming because no other way of putting things has ever occurred to them. With these assumptions, a certain limited number of types of philosophic systems are possible, and this group of systems constitutes the philosophy of the epoch. Our unquestioned philosophy is humanism. It is what shapes and structures much of what we imagine and conceive of. Indeed, we forget that humanism, which we take for granted because it is so intimately entwined with and within us, may only have emerged at the end of the Renaissance. Before then, according to Panikkar, as well as according to many historians, some form or another of cosmocentrism obtained. The central term in cosmocentrism is the word cosmos, something with which you and I have absolutely no direct experience. A cosmos, as the Pythagorean scholar David Fidler nicely describes it, is a living organism with which we are bound in vital participation. And I might add, without which we would not be, nor be intelligible to ourselves. A cosmos, then, is a beautiful order with everything and every being fitting into it just so. It is an intelligible, intelligent, vital, animating spirit, as well as an ordered structure, one that leaves nothing essential out of it. The Hermetic slogan, as above, so below, alludes to how the human being was a microcosm that, in essence, mirrored the reality of the macrocosm. The Jewish mystical book Zohar put it thus: there is not a member in the human body that does not have its counterpart in the world, the cosmos, as a whole. For as a man's body consists of members and parts of varying rank, all acting and reacting upon one another so as to form one organism, so it is with the world at large. It consists of a hierarchy of created things which, when they properly act and react upon one another, together form one organic body. To put some flesh on the bones, so to say, let me turn to the particular model of the cosmos that reigned throughout much of the medieval world. The Ptolemaic cosmos was a finite, spherical, harmonious order in which everything and every body had its rightful place. Listen to C.S. Lewis describe this cosmos as it was understood by medievals. The central and spherical earth, he observes, is surrounded by a series of hollow and transparent globes, one above the other, and each, of course, larger than the one below. These are the spheres, heavens, and sometimes elements. Fixed in each of the first 7 spheres is one luminous body. Starting from Earth, the order is the Moon, Mercury, Venus, the Sun, Mars, Jupiter, and Saturn, the 7 planets, as it was understood. Beyond the sphere of Saturn is the stellatum, to which belong all those stars that we call fixed because their positions relative to one another are, unlike those of the planets, invariable. Beyond the stellatum, there is a sphere called a first movable, or primum mobile. End quote. And what is beyond the first movable, he goes on, dwells heaven wherein God resides. What may not be clear from Lewis's descriptions is that humans are not just situated within this cosmos, but are also, we might say, cut from the same cloth as the rest of reality. The cosmos conception suggests that human beings are at home in the world, and hence that everything is drenched in and saturated by meaning. A brief side remark. I'm not defending the Ptolemaic conception of the cosmos. I'm trying to suggest why it was so significant for human beings' way of being in the world. But then somehow the whole thing came crashing down. The German philosopher Ernst Cassirer summarizes the end of cosmocentrism thusly. The clear-cut form of the classical and medieval cosmos of the world crumbles, he writes, and the world ceases to be a cosmos in the sense of an immediately accessible order of things. Space and time in the universe conception are extended indefinitely. They can no longer be comprehended within that clearly defined scheme which classical cosmology possessed in Plato's doctrine of the 5 regular heavenly bodies or in Aristotle's hierarchical cosmos, nor can they be represented by finite measures and numbers. One world and one being are replaced by an infinity of worlds, constantly springing from the womb of becoming, each one of which embodies but a single transitory phase of the inexhaustible, vital process of the universe. This, in brief, is what one French historian once described as a shift from the closed world to the open universe. Pascal once said that the infinite spaces fill him with dread. He was living right at the transition from the breakdown of the cosmos and the emergence of the universe. What Cassirer hints at here, but does not actually say, is that the emergence of the universe conception coincides with the severance of the human being as a microcosm from the animate world as macrocosm. In other words, our intimate relationship to nature or reality within and without is no more. How cosmocentrism collapsed and in turn opened the door to anthropocentrism or humanism is beyond the scope of this talk. Suffice it to say, historians tend to explain the disappearance in terms of certain tendencies within Christianity, be that man's dominion over the earth, as explained in the book of Genesis, or be that the nominalist theological emphasis on God's infinite potency, and in terms of the new science, the modern science, that in sociologist Max Weber's famous terms, disenchanted the world, removed it of magic, animation, spirit, and the like. Humanism, then, is the name we can give to the time in which we've been living. And what are the chief characteristics of our time? 1, the de-animation of nature, or cosmos, or reality, such that nature is understood in mechanistic terms. Nature is that which is amenable to use for industry, to recreation, or to the disinterested aesthetic gaze. 2, the withdrawal of God from the world, the sounds of the retreating sea of faith that the poet Matthew Arnold heard in the latter half of the 19th century. You can confirm this by just reading about the fact that church-going is really declining among people in the millennial, iGen ages and the like. We have good evidence for this at this point, for the point that Arnold was already experiencing in the mid-19th century. And 3, the ascendancy and autonomy of humankind, the latter being subject only to whatever is rationally binding upon individual and collective human interests. Another way of putting this is to say that we are, at this point, actually fundamentally wrapped up in individual egoic human dramas as well as in social human dramas. You can begin to explain the perplexing, addictive nature of social media only, I think, on the grounds of seeing it based on a humanistic world picture. Let me be clear then. My so far unstated axiom is that any flourishing civilization requires some understanding of and harmonious connection between anthropos, human beings, theos, something divine or holy, and cosmos, the nature of reality. For where otherwise shall we find epistemic, intellectual, and emotional humility? Where shall come our ideas of the sacred, the holy, and the like. What for us cannot be trespassed? Whence our reverence, our sense of meaning, our willingness to die with grace and dignity and love. To philosophize is to learn how to die. The French existentialist philosophy, which presumes that humans are alone in a cold, infinite universe, and that we had better accept courageously the cost of our freedom, seems to me like a civilizational end game. In this broader sense, then, it could be said that our fundamental predicament is spiritual in nature, in all the senses I was trying to capture therein. If, then, humanism is the name we give to what at bottom ails us, then how might we dissolve humanism in the light of greater understanding? It's here that I come back to psychotechnologies. For these are more than cognitive, more than purely cognitive exercises, practices, and meditations, whose aim is to transform our entire being, our way of being in the world, and with it our placement in the more than human world. To be beyond humanism is at one and the same time to get beyond our presumed egoic identity, as well as our conception of the universe as what is separate, other, and different to me. As you know already, I first learned about spiritual exercises from Pierre Hadot. This led me some years later to practice Zen Buddhism, which is to a large degree centered on Zazen, the Japanese term for what Dogen, a 13th century Zen master, once described as sitting immovable like a bold mountain. For a while, I believed that seated meditation could be the be-all and end-all of practice. It would be enough. Perhaps it could be everything needed for transformation. That is, until I heard about cases such as that of Joshu Sasaki Roshi. Joshu was an influential 20th century Zen teacher, having founded a number of important Zen centers in the US, such as Mount Baldy Zen Center, which is just outside of LA, and that's where Leonard Cohen used to sit, before dying at the ripe old age of 107. To many of his male students, Joshu was a deeply insightful teacher, someone very attuned to shunyata, or the boundless nature of ultimate reality. Yet, according to one student and Zen priest Eshu Martin, quote, Joshu's career of misconduct has run the gamut from frequent and repeated non-consensual groping of female students during interviews, to sexually coercive after-hours tea meetings, the tea is in quotes, to affairs and sexual interference in the marriages and relationships of his students. One concept might not be clear to those not familiar with Zen. The word interview doesn't refer to a job interview. It's the translation of words like dokusan or sanzen. That's the time when a student comes into a room where the teacher is, and the student is telling the teacher about where he or she is in practice. So it's a time for understanding and deepening practice. So you can imagine that this is a fairly horrifying situation to be in if you were vulnerable and coming into a room and sexual advances are being made on you. Google Joshu sexual misconduct, and you'll learn much, much more than was talked about here. I wonder, how can it be the case that someone can be enlightened, can see the ultimate nature of reality directly, and yet can also be morally vicious? I can't take up that vital question here, or not in its entirety, except to say that A, I've since come to see that one psychotechnology on its own, such as zazen or seated meditation of a certain kind, however powerful it may be, is not enough to bring about the full development of human beings, and therefore be that I urge what Wilber calls an integral approach, or what I would like to refer to as an all-hands-on-deck approach. What, then, would a systematic, all-hands-on-deck approach look like? One that enabled human beings to be wise. Not just to think about what it is to be wise, or talk about what it is to be wise, or read books about what it is to be wise, but to actually be wise. To be honest with you, I don't know yet, but I do know that such a philosophical investigation would begin with the following question. What are the basic parts or faculties of being human, those that yearn to be cultivated? That's a question of anthropology, that is the nature of human beings in the philosophical sense. From there, the next step would be to create a curriculum in the proper sense of the word, that is a pathway or a life path, which would consist of gradual forms of development of each individual faculty, and at critical junctures, it would be wise to ask, are all these developments in this particular human being becoming integrated into a seamless whole? That is to say, is this creature becoming beautiful? Is there a beautiful organization of that person's being? For now, I'll simply list certain psychotechnologies that I think could bear some fruit. Some of these have been tested for millennia, while others, being raw and new, are in need of further internal and collective experimentation, assessment, and vetting. The first group would center on practices related to enlightenment, the path of enlightenment, the path of self-realization. And there have been a lot of psychotechnologies or practices that have been devised, implemented, tested, and tried out for quite some time. So you can think of seated meditation of all kinds, but I'll just give you one other example. Satsang in the Advaita Vedanta tradition involves devotees or disciples or students sitting around the guru or teacher, and the teacher is asked a question about the nature of reality. Everyone else is not just listening to that question, listening to the answer to that question, they are, as it were, meditating while each question is asked and each answer provided. Therefore, the answer and the question are not intellectual in nature. They are trying to point to something, to bring something about. So there are all sorts of practices focused on enlightenment. The second group brings us to energetics. There are a number of different practices suggesting that beyond our physical form or physical body, there could be some kind of energetic body with which we're not currently in touch. You can think of Qigong or Kundalini or Kriya Yoga as only three such examples. We might ask, what might we learn or investigate or understand in the way of wisdom that could come about in virtue of this kind of energetic investigation? Consider a third group, those focused on physical training. I mentioned only three here: Tai Chi, martial arts, or a certain way of understanding asanas and yoga, provided that it's actually related to yoga philosophy, to where those asanas come from, what the point of them is. Notice that I'm steering clear of certain exercises that you and I are familiar with, let's say resistance training. We might wonder whether resistance training is necessary and sufficient to bring about the transformation of the kind that I'm describing. So each physical practice is not just about the physical form, it's also about the total shift in the creature practicing that particular form. Next set has to do with lucid dreaming. It's puzzling to me that approximately 1/3 of the waking life, or rather 1/3 of life, is actually devoted to sleep. But most of us haven't actually investigated 1/3 of life. We don't know what goes on there. We have no idea what to make of that, nor do we have any idea what to make of how that impacts waking life. Stephen LaBerge, a psychophysiologist, has studied lucid dreaming since the 1980s in a scientific manner. And more recently, Andrew Holacek has been writing about the Tibetan Buddhist practice of dream yoga, which I'll leave off to the side for this talk. I ask, how could we learn about the nature of consciousness through more rigorous investigations of the dream and dreamless states? And how could our own study of ourselves in all states of being influence how we think, feel, sense, and act in waking life? Consider a fifth group. These would have to do with healing practices. There are many therapeutic dispensations and modalities to mention here, but one you may be less familiar with. It's been said that breath work, ranging from pranayama to holotropic to some new forms of breathwork, may be helpful when it comes to addressing traumas. In a private correspondence with this woman, Jennifer Patterson, a breathworker living in New York City, had this to say: I work with a lot of folks with pretty extensive and complex trauma histories connected to child abuse, violence experienced as an adult, illness and autoimmune disease, depression, anxiety, death, and so forth. During a breathwork session, people regularly experience touching down into a deeper, wiser part of themselves, or sometimes understand what happens as an outside energy or higher power. And here she's just reporting on her clients' experiences. Consider a sixth set of psychotechnologies, those grounded in communitas, the Latin word my friend Peter Limberg uses to point to deep shared collective experiences arising out of certain kinds of group practices, or even out of certain rites of passage. The idea is that it may be possible for there to be a certain kind of collective consciousness that emerges in and through a group practice. I told you that if you thought this was a bit woo, then you might have to reassess what you take to be education, or you may take to be self-cultivation. Consider we-space modalities such as circling, which Guy Sengstock defines as a deep, intersubjective, relational yoga. He thinks that this helps to bring about intuitive, ineffable intimacy, deep listening, and it may enable practitioners to go into conflict with someone without going into war, end quote. A seventh set. Imagine something called contemplative science. This is a speculative line of inquiry proposed as early as the 1970s, namely that scientists involved in studying the nature of reality may do well to also contemplate themselves through intensive meditation practices. As above, so below. More recently, the teacher Shinzen Young, in his book The Science of Enlightenment, has urged scientists who study meditation as an object of inquiry, as something going on in the brains of other people, to also become adept meditators themselves. The question worth asking here is, what could a rigorous study of the nature of reality reveal about the nature of the self and vice versa? I mentioned but one last set of psychotechnologies, those having to do with philosophical reflection. Dialogues, philosophical dialogues, which come out of existential openness of the kind I spoke of at the outset, and which are about matters of ultimate concern, can lead, I've observed, to deeper experiential truths. The way of asking questions and the way of providing solutions creates the condition of possibility for someone actually to realize something that otherwise was not available to that person. It's like finding something on the tip of your tongue that you never knew was there, but once you knew it was there, you couldn't possibly imagine you didn't know it ever could be there. There are ways of using words or language that are beyond the merely denotative. They're beyond merely the descriptions. They actually do something to us, with us, and within us. I think this is one particular approach that would help to explain what was wanting in Joshu's education. He was involved in strenuous, rigorous, seated practice, but never did he actually, so far as I know, go through deep ethical investigations of the kind that can be found in the philosophical tradition going back to Socrates. And now, to wisdom. In 1993, Ramon Panikkar wrote, "It has always been the function of the wise to remind their contemporaries of the whole." Yes, and today we need more than mere reminders. We need collective living wisdom. Therefore, let me knit together the previous section on psychotechnologies with this final section on living wisdom by suggesting that psychotechnologies, by virtue of helping to take us beyond humanism, are in the service of living wisdom. What then is living wisdom? I define the term here as the highest conduct for human beings, one that flows directly from the highest understanding of the human, of the cosmos, and of the divine. Wisdom emerges from understanding the whole, the very whole that we have lost in modernity. In other words, if you think about a wise person, this is someone who has actually begun to act in a certain way. That person is compassionate, is kind, is loving, and so on. But when you ask yourself, where does that kindness, compassion, love, courage, or whatever come from? It becomes clear that it comes from the deepest possible understanding. So wisdom is conduct of a certain kind, to wit, right conduct, flowing from right understanding. Therefore, the part of my inquiry that goes beyond the bounds of this talk is, what would constitute a new cosmotheandric vision? Cosmos, Deus, Anthropos. One that coherently orders our best understanding of the cosmos, and understanding that is consistent with modern science. Our best understanding of what is ultimate and nature, and our best understanding of sentient, intelligent life such as ours. What would this whole be? In lieu of undertaking that inquiry here, I would like to conclude my talk this evening by discussing how human beings can begin to go beyond humanism if we choose to cultivate our part of living wisdom. As I see it, there are at least 5 features of the kind of wisdom I have in mind. The first is perceptiveness. To be very perceptive is to pick up on things, salient facts otherwise overlooked, shifts in the temperature of a room, minor or dramatic changes in people's moods, and so on, that are very significant to our overall understanding of what is actually going on here. Perceptiveness, a keen observational virtue, is a skillful art of attention. With a quiet mind and highly attuned senses, the perceptive person notices much more than she can possibly say or need to say. With this noticing more figuring prominently in her overall understanding of the situation and of whatever or whoever is present in that situation. Secondly, considerateness. Being considerate in the way that I wish to talk about it here, that is, giving oneself over to considering a matter, is rather like taking a stone or a pebble in one's hand and turning it over time and time again between one's fingers. The more one turns it over and the more one passes the stone from one finger to the next, the more is one able to assimilate relevant complexity or to come to pristine simplicity. One has not simply touched the soil of the matter at hand. No, one has turned the soil over and over until its richness sings. Being filled up with genuine considerateness is rather like both of these things. Thirdly, thoughtfulness. Being all filled up with thoughtfulness means seeing something through to the very end. One's thoughts seem to reach out toward their implications and in turn toward those implications and so on until thought, in virtue of its having ranged from the first proposal to all the foreseeable things that follow therefrom, is sated. Exceptionally thoughtful people seem to keep asking themselves, whence and where does this go? They are soberly drunk on depth. Fourthly, non-attachment to results. Many wisdom traditions, such as Hinduism, Taoism, Tibetan Buddhism, and Roman Stoicism, underscore the importance of acting to the full while being equanimous about the outcome. The awakened sages call a person wise, Krishna tells Arjuna in the Bhagavad Gita, when all his undertakings are free from anxiety about results. In the Lojong training, which is loosely translated as mind training, but it's more like whole person training or whole mind training, in Tibetan Buddhism, advises the practitioner to abandon all hope of results, a slogan to be repeated over and over again until it becomes second nature. To be clear, the slogan is not saying abandon action. It's abandon the idea of hoping that what you would like to come to pass shall come to pass. Abandon that mistaken idea. Seemingly paradoxically then, a wise person is able to throw himself completely into whatever it is he is doing without getting all tied up in things having to go this way or that way. This is why the Tao Te Ching, one of my favorite sacred books, says that the Taoist sage is able to create and then forget. Finally, the ineffable. It seems fitting to draw this talk to a close by returning to Pierre Hadot. For if what I have said about psychotechnologies and about living wisdom is correct, then what is most essential cannot be put into words. Hadot, who died in 2010, in fact, 1 year after I discovered his writings, once confided to an interviewer when asked about whether he was a pious child in the following stunningly poetic manner. For a long time, he says, I have had the impression of having been in the world only from the time of my adolescence. I will always regret having thrown away, out of Christian humility, he was raised Catholic, the first notes written that were like the echo of my personality. For it is very difficult for me now to rediscover the psychological content of the overwhelming discoveries I made then. I do remember their framework. One happened on Rue Renard, on the path I took home to my parents' house every day from the Petit Séminaire. Night had fallen. The stars were shining in the immense sky, think of the cosmos. At this time, one could still see them. Another took place in a room of our house. In both cases, I was filled with an anxiety that was both terrifying and delicious, provoked by the sentiment of the presence of the world, or of the whole, or of me in the world. In fact, I was incapable of formulating my experience. But after the fact, I felt that it might correspond to questions such as, what am I? Why am I here? What is this world I am in? I experienced a sentiment of strangeness, of astonishment, and of wonder at being there. At the same time, I had the sentiment of being immersed in the world, of being a part of it, the world extending from the smallest blade of grass to the stars. This world was present to me, immensely present. Much later, I would discover that this awareness of belonging to the whole was what Ramon Rollard called the oceanic sentiment. I believe I have been a philosopher since that time. He leans in at the end, going on to say, I did not dare tell anyone what I had experienced. I felt for the first time that there are things that cannot be said. What was most essential for us could not be expressed. Thank you very much.
We have time for a couple of questions, if anybody would like to catch the, okay, we've got two right here.
Can you hear me? Yes?
It's not, okay. Yeah, I can hear you.
Are you familiar with A Course in Miracles, which is a contemporary scripture that combines Buddhism with God?
Yes, I've heard of it. In fact, I went to a retreat recently in which someone was talking about it, but I myself have not read it.
It's a simple oneness that underscores everything and gives you a path for regular householders to experience philosophy, psychology, mindfulness, and awakening. So I just throw that to you.
Thank you very much.
Hi, thank you. I know by asking this question I may be inviting another talk of equal length, but if there is a short answer you can give, I'll start by acknowledging that some of these may be disregarded by school systems as religious in nature and so might be excluded. But some of the techniques that you were talking about could be done in a secular way, at least as much as possible to get them into a public school system. How could you see the curriculum that our children are taught being modified to at least help get us towards a better path? People live what they learn, and they tend to be more closed as they reach adulthood in a lot of cases. So how could we start them young?
I think it's a lovely question. Here comes a second talk. I'm just kidding. Everyone runs out here. Oh no. The place to begin really is with acknowledging that we have shrunk down what we think a human being is about. We really do think that it's about a certain kind of discursive understanding that manifests itself only in a few different ways. Joseph Pieper thought that our educational systems were making us into functionaries. Right? Those are capable of functioning in an economic system. We also seem to think that the only sorts of things that really matter to a great deal are logos in nature, by which I mean a certain particular kind of rationality. So until we recognize that this is a very beautiful but limited approach, we can't possibly go on with being open to the sorts of things I was talking about this evening. So let's imagine that you have a certain school system that is open. It notes that we're experiencing anime, we're experiencing the rise in suicide rates among doctors and nurses. You can begin to notice that there are certain malaises, to say the least, that are affecting us, and not just those out there, but those right here and now. All right, so now you have an openness to the possibility of checking out things that are beyond the logos. Then I think you can begin to, it depends on your point of view here. So one might be what's called a Trojan horse. That is, you would begin to expose them to, very gently expose them to, for example, mindfulness meditation. But don't go too far, because you would simply want them to be able to witness their thoughts and feelings and emotions and perceptions and sensations as they arise. When I say don't go too far, I mean if you get very far into meditation practices, you realize that they're beyond simply observing your thoughts and feelings and perceptions, and you end up getting into some pretty trippy stuff. So the Trojan horse approach would be to begin to implement practices that seem to have efficacious effects. You would take the language of the day and you would say these seem to be efficacious in terms of health, they seem to be efficacious in terms of mental health, and so on. If you have a more open-minded school, then you begin to have philosophical investigations of what counts as religious and what counts as secular. At which point, you would begin to become much more open to the possibility that there are all sorts of practices we'll need, not just now, but in the future, if it's the case that we're going to be not just resilient enough, but as Nassim Taleb says, anti-fragile enough to live in the world. I could go on and very specifically, but it's what the Buddha would call skillful means. One is really trying to, and it's not crude, you're just trying to find the kind of argument that's suitable to the audience at hand. Jesus once said that we need to have, I'm only speaking to those who have, quote, ears to hear. So he's modifying the message of his teaching to the particular level of the people with whom he's speaking. You see this very beautifully done by the Buddha. So you really want to figure out at what level of discourse people are operating to see what therefore is in the adjacent possible to be done there.
Okay, we have time for another question that begs for a shorter answer. I'm just kidding.
I see what's going on here.
Earlier in your presentation, you mentioned the fact the Christian church was dying and that millennials and Gen X's were leaving the churches. Given that thought, what do you contribute to the rise of the evangelical movement in our culture and its powerful grip over our society and politics?
You want a short answer? All right. Well, I'll take a crack at it. So the first answer is that I don't know, but it is true that a number of organized religions are actually losing membership, and you can verify that for yourself. So let's start with that. Hopefully, we can start with that fact. Let's also start with another fact, which is not about religion per se, but about the sociology of religion. On this understanding, religions have been very good at providing a certain kind of social coherence or social glue. And so far, I don't think that secularism has been able to actually pick up the slack by providing the kinds of group formations necessary and sufficient for making people feel as if they're at home in the social world. Therefore, if evangelical Christians are very good at providing charismatic ways of making people feel as if they are at home among one another and as if they can rely upon one another, then it seems not unsurprising, given our age of loneliness, that this would be not a bad place to turn. So that's the answer, really is situated in terms of the claim according to which human beings are isolated and lonely, and they can't find them through Facebook or Twitter or other online platforms that are too thin to be able to provide that social coherence. That's just a conjecture, though. Don't take that as.
I think that was a very good answer.
Oh, thank you.